Cool. Thanks everyone. We're going to start the next talk. This by Nico. It's called The State of Rust UI.
Hello, I'm Nico, Nico Burns. I've just got like a slide about me and then a slide about what I'm going to talk about, and then I'll actually get into the talk. And I don't have any demos, so hopefully it will be like short and sweet, which will be a nice like compliment to Nick's that went into all the details. So I have a background as a full stack developer, so like JavaScript, web backends, that kind of stuff. I got into Rust round about when it hit like 1.0, which I realized is like 8 years ago or something now. It seems crazy. And more recently, in the last kind of year or so, I've kind of combined my two interests by first working on a library called Taffy, which is an implementation of the kind of web layout, flexbox, and CSS grid algorithms in Rust. And then I'm just about to start working on something called Blitz and Servo. So Servo is like a web browser that Mozilla created, which I guess a bunch of you, is anyone familiar with this? Yeah. And Blitz is a new project which we're just kicking off, which is to kind of create a very modular web view that's hackable, using some of the Servo components, using Taffy that I worked on before, and some of the kind of popular ecosystem libraries like Winit and other libraries for rendering, etc. I also maintain blessed.rs, which I put on there just because it's quite a good resource if you want to look up crates. I've got a list of UI crates on there. It's a list of crates that are useful in Rust that are kind of recommended by me, I guess. The idea is that it's like community maintained, but it's kind of just me. And I moved to Auckland in January from the UK. So, you know, if anyone wants to be friends, then say hi. Okay. What I'm not going to cover in this, apart from briefly here, is if you're doing like a TUI, terminal interface, I would recommend Ratatouille. Which is good for that, but I'm not going to talk about. If you're doing immediate mode, so if you want something that is kind of going to render every frame anyway, it's just debug, you don't really care how it looks, then eGUI is a good option. But I'm kind of going to focus on things that you might like ship to an end user that need to be power efficient, accessible, etc. And eGUI doesn't do that. I'm not going to cover Flutter or GTK because they're kind of not really Rust, although you can use them with Rust. GTK has the two libraries that you can use, and Flutter has this Rust Flutter bridge where I think you write the UI in Flutter, but you can kind of do Rust stuff underneath. And I'm also not going to talk about kind of bindings to like Cocoa or Win32, mostly just because they're not very good, I don't think, in Rust. And if you're going to use those, I recommend you use Swift or Objective-C or C# or whatever. And what I am going to cover is some kind of foundational libraries in the Crates.io ecosystem that are used for building UIs. You wouldn't necessarily want to use them directly unless you're kind of building your own framework, but it's good to know about them, I think. And if you are interested in contributing to a UI framework, then it's good to know about. I'm going to cover some kind of web and web view based UI, which again is like questionable whether it's really a Rust UI, but it's kind of the best option at the moment. If you actually want to ship something production ready, you probably ought to be using that. So I'm going to cover it. And then I'm going to cover some Rust native UI libraries, some suggestions for ones to use. I'm not going to cover all of them because there are not hundreds, but tens, and it would take forever. But so I've got some suggestions of ones that you might want to use if you do want to build a UI in Rust. And then I'm going to cover a few things, projects, things that are happening in 2024 that hopefully will be interesting. Okay, so first we have the UI building blocks. This in the slide is just basically a big list. I'm not going to go through all of them, but they're on there. I was going to include links, but you can just look up these names on Crates.io or Google. But how familiar are people with Rust UI here? Have you done something? Yeah. Okay, so first off we have Winit, which creates a window, it interacts with the operating system APIs, it does like mouse handling, keyboard handling, There's also quite a lot of stuff that it probably should do but doesn't yet. Clipboard is in there, and you can kind of get other libraries to do that, but it would be better if when it did it, because you can get better integration. Stuff like drag and drop, and also IME, which is like something method input. Yeah, which is for languages that require you to do accents or like compose characters, so like Japanese, Chinese languages that have got like a composed glyph, but it's also, I think, used to, if you've got like a phone and you do like autocorrect and stuff like that, that all goes through the IME interface. So it'd be really good if we could get that. What we also do have is a bunch of low-level rendering options. WGPU is like the star of the ecosystem at the moment, which is like this abstraction over Vulkan, Metal, and DirectX 12. And you can also run it on the web because it's the basis of WebGPU. But there are also OpenGL bindings and like just CPU rendering support. And there are a bunch of these kind of higher level libraries that are rather than writing shaders yourself, you can go, I'm going to do a rectangle or some text or an image or whatever. One of which I think is particularly interesting is Velo, which is like this like super performant one, but it's kind of not there yet. I think the ones that I see people using the most are Skia, which is the renderer used in Chrome, or Femto VG, which is an OpenGL, and then the other ones are kind of getting there, but they're not widely used. And WebRender is really good, and it's production ready, and it's used in Firefox, but the documentation is terrible. So I wouldn't necessarily use it. And then AccessKit, I think, deserves a mention, which is for like adding accessibility APIs, primarily like screen reader support to applications, which I think is really important just to make sure, because if you're using kind of more traditional toolkits, they all support this stuff, and everyone can then use your application. So personally, I wouldn't ship an end user application that didn't support this, I think. It's good to know about. And then I've got this second set of building blocks, which are kind of sit at a slightly higher level, some of them anyway. We have Taffy and Morpform, which do like kind of laying out your widgets on the screen. So Taffy does like web style layout with Flexbox. Morpform kind of does its own thing, which is arguably simpler and new and kind of easier to work with. That's their pitch anyway. And they're both kind of libraries that you can integrate into anything as a standalone thing, if that makes sense. There's also a bunch of CSS stuff that comes from the Servo project. Now, you don't necessarily need anything like CSS to do UI. You can just do it code-based. But I think it's quite cool that we have this support in Rust. I think not many other language ecosystems have all this tooling to resolve CSS selectors, and etc. And some of the Rust UI crates are kind of making use of that to either do CSS itself or something CSS-like that kind of uses the CSS syntax without necessarily the semantics of what the properties mean in web CSS. And then the other ones I call out here are the text layout libraries, Cosmic Text and Parley. Text layout is obviously super important. You need to be able to render text, and you really probably need to be able to render like bidirectional text, so you can have left to right and right to left, ideally vertical text as well, if you are rendering languages that need that. And then there's bits of that we kind of don't have good support for currently, like if you want to be able to render an image in line with your text or some other kind of widget in line with your text, that's kind of not really supported in Rust native UIs currently. And hopefully it will be. If you're interested in any of these things, then yeah, look up the project names. I think it's very cool that Rust is modular in this way. I feel like if you have something like GTK, it's not modular in the same way. You can't pull bits out and use them in other projects. And hopefully that means we'll get something that's like very high quality, and if bits of it don't work, then it can be pulled out and used in a different project instead. Okay, so the next section is Should I stop for questions here before I move on?
I don't have questions on the first part.
No? Maybe we'll just do questions at the end.
Can you use like Tailwind or
Tailwind.
for the CSS?
Yeah, so in the set of frameworks that I'm using next that are kind of web-based, you can use that kind of like Tailwind syntax. If it's some of the frameworks that are kind of doing something different to web, then you have to use whatever they provide. A lot of it's kind of similar. I mean, you know, there's only so many different syntaxes you can have for setting a color or a shadow or whatever, but it is not quite the same. Yes.
What's the consensus around the community about using existing C libraries, like using HuffBuzz and maybe like form config and stuff like that, and maybe even Skier, which are not written in Rust? Are there any worries about using unsafe libraries?
So firstly, I think it's quite an assumption that you're making that there is a consensus. But I guess it depends a little bit on the library as well. I think it's interesting you mentioned HuffBuzz because so there is a port of HuffBuzz to Rust called RustyBuzz, which was maintained by someone whose GitHub username is something like Razor Falcon for ages. And they were like, this is too much work, I can't keep doing this, and I'm going to deprecate it. And work has actually been picked up by someone, I'm not entirely sure who, but I can see that there's new commits and it's being maintained. But whether that can be sustained, I'm not sure. So I'm definitely seeing a lot of people go, actually, maybe we'll just use HuffBuzz bindings. I know Servo are using HuffBuzz itself, and I think like the kind of Xylem is probably planning to do the same. Cosmic Text is currently using Swash for shaping. Oh no, sorry, Cosmic Text is using RustyBuzz for shaping. It's using Swash for rasterizing.
Is Cosmic System 76 desktop environment?
Yes. Yeah, so Cosmic itself is the desktop environment from System 76. Cosmic Text is their kind of text library. And it's been picked up by quite a lot of projects that are using it for their text. I know of at least 2 Rust UI libraries, Freya and Vizia, that are using just the C bindings to C-Skier, and it seems to work pretty well. The downside seems to be build time and the fact that it won't build on docs.rs, so like doing the docs is a bit of a pain. But that's a bit specific to Skier, I think, which is just notoriously difficult to build. I guess the overall approach might be like use a Rust one if there is a good one, but if there's not, then C is fine. Okay, so this section has a bunch of UI frameworks that are kind of a bit web-like, starting with some actual web frameworks. So these are used to render to a literal web browser like Chrome or Firefox. They run in WebAssembly and WASM, which doesn't have access to the DOM, but there are libraries like WASM, BindGen, and there's one whose name I can't remember that has bindings for all the DOM APIs auto-generated that they use. They are just about reaching, I would say, the kind of level of maturity where you might actually consider using them. They've got bundle sizes, the competitive JS, the performance is very good, compares with the best JS libraries, which is interesting, so it's much faster than something like React. I think the downsides are you kind of need to know Rust and web. It's not like I'm going to learn this and then I don't need to learn the web APIs. You kind of need to know both. So if you were certainly going to use that in a commercial context, like that might make hiring difficult, etc. But from a technical perspective, I think they're in quite a good place, which is interesting because I don't think they were a year or two ago. And the ones I'd recommend looking at if you're wanting to do front-end web in Rust is Leptos, Dioxus, or Sycamore. I think they all work, so I don't necessarily want to recommend one. You could check them out in that order, but I think they're all good. There are some other ones like U, which are a bit older, and I think they're kind of fine, but I wouldn't recommend them. I think there are better ones. And the reason that I kind of put that slide in there is because of this one. So Tauri is basically Electron in Rust. So Electron is like uses a web view for the UI, and then has like a kind of a Node.js layer as well, where you can do kind of just like interacting with files and back-endy system-y stuff. And Tauri also has a web view, although it's different because Electron ships a copy of Chromium with every app, and Tauri links to system web views that ship with the operating system, which also means that it supports mobile, so Android and iOS as well as desktop, whereas if you're using Electron, you'd have to use something else for the mobile side of things. And it basically has a kind of an IPC layer that allows you to communicate between the Rust code and so the front-end code can either be JavaScript or it can be one of the frameworks that we saw on the previous slide. But the UI is effectively just the same as you'd get in a web browser. And the caveat, I guess, is that because it uses a system web view, that means that it's not necessarily going to be the same on every platform. You have the same kind of like cross-browser testing compatibilities that you might have otherwise, although I don't think anything's using Firefox, so you kind of just have to test Chrome and Safari, I guess, but the versions that are shipping system web views.
Does Tauri do any kind of backfill to mitigate that, to make the APIs more consistent, or does it just kind of expose whatever the way to do
I don't think it does any polyfilling of the kind of the front end web stuff. I think it does some polyfilling of stuff that doesn't come in the web view, so you get like system menus and tray icons, notifications. Those are the three things I saw when I was looking this up, but I think there'll be kind of more coming on that side of things. But no, I think is mainly the answer to that. But they're not that different, the web views these days. Like
standard JS, like we figured out a few using JS.
Yeah.
Kind of got polyfill.
Well, it's also just the case that the web views are much more standards compliant than they used to be. It used to be you'd have Internet Explorer and you'd have Firefox, and they did completely different things, and that's just not the case now. Now it's more the case like you have to look up how recent a feature you're allowed to use that's actually supported and everything, and it's usually quite recent.
Well, and you still use the JavaScript build system in Tauri. You're not getting rid of that. So you would put the polyfills on the JavaScript build system side of things.
Right.
Yeah. And then, currently it's the system web views, but there is also a plan, and there's active development on a servo integration where you'd replace the web view with the servo web view, which may also require a bit more development on servo for that to be useful. But that would then give you, I guess, the same kind of consistency you get from Electron, but potentially a bit lighter weight. But also, I guess, servo's not got the same level of engineering that Chrome has got into it, so it might not be quite as fast. But I think Tauri is a good option if you want to do a Rust UI. If you would consider using something like Electron otherwise, then you get much smaller binary sizes, and you get to use Rust for the kind of the node side of things. And because it's using the system web views, it has all the accessibility and stuff that you kind of get with that. And then the thing that I would mention, this is the last web style one. So we mentioned Dioxys as something you can render to a web browser, but it does also have specific, what it calls desktop and mobile support. And this is using Tauri. It's a wrapper on top of Tauri, but it doesn't run the code, its kind of UI code in WASM in this mode. And this is, so Dioxys is kind of an equivalent to React. So you're thinking of like writing like components that render DOM elements basically, and it's got a virtual DOM, etc. The latest version might be using some other technology, but it's the same kind of thing. But it actually, rather than having the overhead of running in a WASM runtime, it actually runs all of that kind of UI state management code in native Rust. It uses like an IPC channel to kind of directly. There's still a bit of JavaScript that's kind of doing all the DOM stuff, but I think that's pretty cool. And this does then come with its own kind of like build toolchain, etc. Comes with hot reloading, asset management. So I think if I was going to build something using web technologies, I'd be quite tempted to use this if I was doing like a kind of a desktop or mobile support's not great currently. I'd say in general in the Rust UI ecosystem, mobile support is at your own risk. And then there'll be more on this later in the later section, but there is a kind of native renderer coming for Darksys as well. Okay, so now we have some more native UI frameworks. Iced is probably the best supported. It does rendering using WGPU. It also has like a software renderer, so if either your device is too old to support WGPU or you just want kind of lower overhead, so like WGPU is the whole big thing, it has RAM requirements, etc., you can use the software renderer. It's been picked up by System76 for their Cosmic desktop environment, so it's got quite a lot of development momentum around it. And I'd say it's definitely of the kind of Rust native UIs, it's the most well supported, it's got the most complete feature set. And I would recommend it if you want to do Rust native and you want to build it now, starting today. I'd say on the downside, like it uses this Elm architecture, which is kind of similar to like Redux or Elm itself, and it's all about message passing. So if you want to respond to a click or whatever, you have to pass a message, and every single event in your entire app in Iced has to go in one enum. It can be a nested enum, and so it's kind of quite opinionated in how you do things, which would be what I would say the downside is. And it certainly works, like you can do it like that, but I found it somewhat annoying to work with personally. And yeah, there's a roadmap here, which I've just included the link for, if you're interested. Hopefully we'll share around the slides. Cool. So I've picked out 3 frameworks, and this is the second one. It's called Floem. There's a little code sample there. So Ice is very much like not web-like at all. It does its own thing. It's got this kind of functional message passing style. You kind of implement this trait in order to create a widget. Floem is still like code first implementation. You're writing Rust code to define your UI, but if you look at what these methods actually are, they're kind of defining web-like CSS properties.
It's kind of a builder pattern. It's kind of a builder pattern.
What's that?
It's like a builder pattern.
Yeah, it's a builder pattern. So it's kind of the layout model for Floem is just the web one. It's using Taffy, it's Flexbox, it's CSS Grid. All of the kind of like styling, colors and stuff are all kind of web-like, just encoded in this builder pattern DSL. And yeah, this is I think also usable today. It's not got as much development behind it as Iced, but it does have a team of, I don't know, a handful of developers that are creating this Lapse text editor. And I think it's a good option. And then I put a couple of C alsos here, which is GPUI, which is used by the Z text editor, which is taking a similar approach. It's currently macOS only, but there is active development to bring, I think, first to Linux, and then maybe Windows might come later. And then also Xylem, which is the successor to Druid, which kind of actually predated Floem and inspired it, but it just hasn't materialized yet. So you can't really use that, but it's one to watch. And then on the other side of things is Visia, which is kind of taking the other side of the web. So this, if you look at the code example, is literally using CSS-like syntax, but the actual properties that it's representing, some of them are kind of the same as CSS, like the background color, but like colon between or child space are not CSS layouts. So the actual layout model is different. This uses, it has been using FemtoFiji. As we speak, it's being rewritten to use Skia. You probably don't need to care about that. It's more of an implementation detail. But I think it's interesting to just see as a different kind of perspective on how a Rust UI might look. This is mostly a one-person project. There are some other open source contributors, but I think it's quite actually complete considering that. And I've put a couple of C authors here, which are Freya, which is a backend for Dioxys that uses the Dioxys kind of state management layer, but does its own widgets, again, with kind of different properties that you might set. And Slint, which is also doing custom DL, and probably should get a shout out if you want to do a UI on an embedded device. Slint's probably where to look, although you may need a commercial license and a fairly powerful microcontroller.
Microcontrollers, it seems more like an embedded lens.
Yeah, I think it probably is. Somewhat, yeah. Okay, so those are my native. Sorry, there's not lots of detail, there's not code examples, but I'm just trying to give you a kind of an overview. And then I've got a couple more slides on kind of things that are going to happen in 2024, and then we'll have questions. There's an organization called Linebender, although probably better known by the name Xylem, which is their kind of headline project. They have 4 developers funded for 2024. And so there should be quite active development going on here. We should expect a release of their Xylem framework, which has its own state management layer, and it will also kind of have its own widget implementation underneath that. And it has quite an interesting widget trait, which allows you to kind of implement your own layout or draw or whatever, which is quite flexible, and I think it's really interesting. They are developing a renderer called Velo, which has been quite research focused and has very fast state-of-the-art path rendering. If you want to animate an SVG or anything that's vector-based, it's fantastic. And I think there will be work on that this year to make it a bit more production ready. There's currently just rendering glitches if you use it in the wrong way. And it does things it can't do very well. So we should be getting that, which I think is quite exciting, and I think a lot of projects will be able to use that. They're also working on improved text support. Some of that is in the quite low levels of the stack, so literally just passing font files. There's some projects out of Google Fonts for that as well. And then text layout and making sure that you can do all those kind of layouty things with text, alignment, images, bidirectional text, etc. They also have an Android focus for their development. So they will be putting work into Winit to improve Android support, and will also be doing IME implementation for Android. Unfortunately, it seems not iOS unless someone else steps up to do that. But hopefully, I don't know, one's better than none, I guess.
Are they funded by Google or something?
Yes, so the funding is coming from Google Fonts, of which a couple of the kind of members of the open source organization also just happen to work there. So it's A, got an Android focus, presumably because the funding is coming from Google, and B, it's got a text focus because the funding is coming from Google Fonts. And they've also funded the creator of Access Kit, so hopefully we'll see some improvements there. What I've heard about Access Kit from people who've used it is, I'm so glad it exists. It's like so much better than trying to like do each of the APIs individually, but also it's a bit of a pain. So hopefully we'll get to the point where it's not a bit of a pain anymore, but we'll see. From the Servo project, there was a project going on kind of between Tauri and Servo, which I mentioned earlier, to kind of allow you to use Servo as the kind of web view for Tauri, which I think is cool. And I think that might end up leading to just a general ability to embed a web view inside a different Rust UI, which I think would be cool. Obviously, you might want a web view, even if you're not doing web generally. And also, there is momentum towards actually releasing some of the crates which have been around for a while. So stylo, selectors, and web render are all used in Servo. They're also all used in Firefox. So they're actively maintained. You know, when Firefox implements a new CSS feature, it goes into stylo because it's Firefox's CSS engine. So the idea here is to get crates.io releases and kind of ongoing releases and maintenance and ability to submit a pull request, etc. For those, which I think is cool. And then finally, this is a bit indulgent because it's what I'm going to be working on, but I think it's really cool. There's this Blitz project from Dioxys, which is basically a custom web view. It's using Stylo for the CSS stuff. It's using Taffy for layout. It's using Cosmic Text for the kind of inline text layout. Velo for rendering, AccessKit for accessibility. It's kind of using all of the ecosystem libraries that are, not all of them obviously, but a lot of them, that are generally usable. So it's trying not to do as little as possible that's just proprietary to itself, if that makes sense. And so I think we'll see how well it ends up working, but to try and allow you to swap out components and put your own bits in as well. The idea is that you would render directly from Rust. So if your state management is using Dioxys, then it can directly manipulate an API that is in Rust. It doesn't need to go through JavaScript. There wouldn't be a JavaScript engine included at all. So hopefully you get kind of lower memory overhead, etc. And then possibly the possibility of like having your own custom widgets in a web view. So we're mostly using web, but if you want to have your own widget that does graph rendering or virtualization or whatever it is that it does, then we'll be able to do that. But this is what Google.com currently looks like in Blitz. So there's a bit of work to be done. Yeah, any questions?
You didn't mention Rust binding for Qt.
I didn't know.
I think that was in the do not
Is that GTK and Flutter? I didn't say Qt.
So my understanding is that because Qt is C++ and not C, and it makes quite heavy use of C++ features like inheritance and also macros, it's a bit of a nightmare to bind to. And there are people doing it, but kind of like with the web ones, you kind of need to know web and Rust. To use those, you need to be kind of like an expert in Qt and an expert in Rust. So and C++, and I just really wouldn't recommend that to anyone.
Basically, with Qt, you're opting for the entire C++ object model.
Yeah. It's true. It's built around that.
Yeah, which is a bit of a shame because Qt is great. But
Yeah, related question. For
Yep.
those of us who think that QML is like peak designing UX, is there something like this in the Rust ecosystem where you describe constraints rather than like CSF, where you just try your best to get the layout engine to do something sensible?
so I'm not personally very familiar with QML, but so it's as far as I'm aware, it's
The thing I'm after is describing constraints. So like rather than saying like this is a box that's this wide and stuff, you say this is a box that's exactly between this box and this box, and like has these relations to these other objects.
So interestingly, as far as I'm aware, the project that's doing the closest to that is actually Ratatouille in the TUI space. So if you want to do a TUI with constraint-based layout, then it exists. I feel like their engine is probably not really TUI specific. It's all intertwined with their code currently, but it could be done. I know for Taffy, which currently does almost entirely web layout, we kind of figured it could be done. It could do other kinds of layout as well. You know, if you have a box and you just want to go, I want to lay out its contents, there's no reason why you can't switch between algorithms at each level, if that makes sense. And I did do some research on implementing a kind of like Apple auto layout style thing, which is also a similar like constraint-based model. And I think, there's no real reason why it couldn't be done in Rust, but nobody's really done it.
Slint is basically Qt in Rust, because the original people who created Slint was the people.
Yeah, but is it like Qt widgets in Rust, or is it like QML?
Slint DSL is called .slint, but it's really just
Okay.
QML in Rust.
They ended up with the same license.
It's very simple.
Yeah, so I stand corrected. Slint are doing it. I don't know the details of their layouting model, but they definitely do have that similar thing where it's like a separate text file with a DSL that defines the UI.
Not a question, but a comment. So Dioxys and Lactose, which was somewhere in the middle of the presentation.
Mm.
They're both reactive when you define your UI, but Diaxis allows you to single source define your UI, and it should be able to render to terminal, maybe app, web app, depending on the imported module for that UI. So it's a single source for your UI definition, but it will render to different applications. Whereas Lactose is purely for the web. And I've tried both. They're both really nice to use. So I think both are quite interesting to watch because they are really focused on getting the performance right.
Yeah, I mean, I think that brings up an interesting point, which is there is the possibility with Rust UI that you might at some point be able to write one code base that renders to web and renders to a native desktop mobile app, which would be very cool. The only thing that kind of really does that now is, I think, React Native Web, and it's not great because it was kind of a bit of an afterthought. There's a couple of different approaches to doing it. So Diaxis is basically saying, we're going to adopt the web API and we'll do a native render for it, but it's basically just a web view at that point, but with kind of maybe a few extras. Xylem has a web prototype as well, but they're kind of going more, well, we're going to define our custom API and we're going to maybe try and render that to web as well, but it's less of a priority for them. But I think they could both work, and they're both targeting actually rendering to the web DOM rather than just doing a canvas element on the web, which maybe you can do in Flutter, but it's not great.